Okay, this tutorial will just cover just the basics of how to use variables, and in this case it'll be just floats. I know when I started out, the idea of what a variable represented and how I would use this was kind of confusing. I was used to kind of like uh, fixed numbers or fixed decisions, and the idea that what variables represent, the idea that they're just a container, maybe that's the way to think of it, that are going to hold some numbers that are going to change over the time that allows to animate things or whatever is an important part of programming, obviously. We want to have variables because it gives us this flexibility to change things. So I wanted to try to cover that and maybe give you a way to think about them a little bit more. So maybe it makes more sense to artists and designers. So go ahead and just run the sketch here. It's just a default. We have our little ellipse here, and I've got a background, I've got fill, and I've got a set XY coordinate for the ellipse here. So we have width divided by 2 and height, so we're right here in the center of the screen. So let's go ahead and, variable. Let's just call these very surprising names here. Call these X and Y. So these are variables. You can see they're just highlighted black. So in processing's world, these aren't really doing anything. And if I try to run this sketch, processing is going to throw an error at me and say that the component X is not visible. So the ellipse is looking for these kind of things. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory. We haven't defined what those are going to be. So when we use a variable, we first need to tell processing what type of container is this going to be. Processing, maybe you can think of variables as little buckets that processing puts off to the side for memory. And it wants to know what type that is going to be, as well as other programs when you're writing this. So we want to say float. So we're going to have a floating point number so that we can have decimal points. So maybe this is going to exist at, tiny little increments across the screen. So we'll say float, and we'll call this X. Let's make it equal to, now in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just looking at size. This is 600 by 600, so half of that is going to be 300. And I'm not going to call that because it's not really included. In fact, you know what? Let's do a little experiment here. Let's see if that throws an error at us. So that's the float width. And let's go with Y. And let's say this is height divided by 2. And we'll go ahead and say run. And right off the bat, you can see that the circle is here at the center because it didn't understand what width divided by 2 and height divided by 2 were because I hadn't called size yet. And because these are global variables at the beginning, I haven't reassigned them to anything else. So at the very beginning, processing says, okay, we're going to have a bucket that's going to be of the type float, and we're going to just arbitrarily name this X. This could be any name. This is just what we've decided to call it. This could be, Bob or Susie, but in this case, it makes sense to call it X. So we're going to have X, and we're going to make it equal to width divided by 2. But processing doesn't know what that is yet because I haven't said size. So it just says, okay, for now, I will consider that to be 0. In fact, to prove this point, let's go down. Let's say print line X. So you should all remember this. Oops, needs to be a lowercase. So this is going to say print every time you go through here on a new line. So print line is what this means, X. And if I press run, you can see it keeps saying 0. Now, so the reason why this is happening is processing at the very beginning doesn't know what this keyword is, so it's just going to say, okay, I'll just make X 0 for now. And then we don't tell processing what X is here, and we don't tell processing what X is here. So processing is like, well, you told me at the beginning that it equals this thing that I didn't understand, so I'm going to make it 0. And I'm going to leave it at 0 until you change it. And again, that's the whole idea with variables, is we declare them so that we maybe start out in a certain place, but later on we can change where they're going to go. And you can also use variables for the other key reason is that you only want to do this once. So maybe we have something called the size of the ellipse, so 100, 100. So let's just, in fact, let's do that. So let's say float rad for radius, and we'll call this 100. All right. So you might say, well, so big deal. I'll go ahead and play this. And of course, it's going to say 0. It's going to put it up there. And our ellipse, even though it's in the corner, is still the same size. So big deal. Why did you leave this as rad? Well, this is a simple example, and we only have one ellipse. But what if we wanted the ellipse, the arc, the rectangle, everything that's in my scene to be the same radius, the same size? And I decided right at the beginning, hey, I'm going to make that 100. And I had ellipse, I had rectangle, I had all these things, and I had to keep typing in 100. And this one's going to be 100. Oops. What happens later on if I have, just to prove my point here, we'll call this 40 and 40 and 100 and 100. What if I turn around and say, you know, oops, sorry, error there. Got excited in my coding here. What if I was like, actually 400 or 100 is too big. I don't like that. So I'd have to go back and say 200, that one's 200, okay, that one's 200. You can see this would be a pain in the butt, okay? Let's go ahead and delete that because we're not going to use it. So if I just put rad here, and if I put rad on the size of the rectangle or the arc or whatever it might be, I would only have to change this once. So let's just say, hey, I want all of these crazy geometric objects that I'm creating here to have a radius or a size of 200. Then I would be set up, and I'd only have to change this once. So we have two examples here. At least we're about to set up the other example. Here, we want to declare a variable because we're going to use this variable multiple times for multiple objects, even though we're not here. Again, let's go back and do that. 300, 300, and rad, and rad. That's rectangle. Mode, center. All right, so that's in the center. That's this size here. So again, the convenience would be like, well, I want these all to be similar to each other. So now I could just come back and say, you know what, let's make them 100. So that'd be one reason to use the float or variable up here. But the other one is that we want the position of this to change. So let's go up and make x or equal to 0. To 0. And we have the same x and y. So it's going to do the same thing. I don't know if you're seeing this on my screen capture. It's kind of glitching a little bit here and there. But again, it's printing and it just says 0. But right at the end, I'm going to say, you know what? Let's make x, again, the long version of this would be x equals x plus 1. In fact, let's do it this way. Let's say y equals y plus 1. I like to put my spaces in there. All right, so now I'll go ahead and press play. And you can see there goes my ellipse across the screen, and it's changing because I keep changing the variable. So let's talk about what's going on here. So we start out and we say, hey, processing, set aside this bucket. It's going to be called x, and for now, call it 0. And I say, go ahead and put that ellipse at 0 and 0. And when you get done, let's go ahead and add 1 to it. So let's make x 1 and 1. So now processing ignores this. It's no longer equal to 0. That's just the container said, I'm willing to put aside a float. I'm going to name it with this arbitrary name that you've decided is going to be x and y. And for now, I'll put this value in there. And then I just go ahead and say, you know what, that's what we're going to use, but I'm going to change this over time. Let's go back. All right. So, and you can see x is just continuing to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's no surprise when it reaches 600, it's going to start to go off the screen there. And then we can also add one last bit of logic. We could say, what if x is greater than, what is our size there, 600. In fact, let's make it 800, so it actually goes off the screen there. So what if it's bigger than 800, let's make x equal to random width. That just means it's going to get placed anywhere along that top. All right, so let's go ahead and press that. So again, we see x starts out as 0. That's where we started. It's incrementing across here, so it's just adding 1, adding 1, adding 1. We can see the printout, which is a great idea for us to see what's happening. And it moves across the screen. Oh, and so last bit here, we need to actually, let's also say if y, so we reset the x, but we didn't reset the y. So if it's greater than 800, sorry, I'm tidy with my little code here. Let's say y equals 0. All right, now this will work for us. So again, it's traveling across the screen. You can see our printout of x. Before we would have seen the change in the numbers as well, but we'll let it go across the screen. And you can see once it went past that, it chose a random position in x here across the top, but it put y at the 0. So you can see it's just kind of jumping this back and forth based on where the x is and setting it to that random position. So again, the idea here is that change. We have these two ideas with I guess I should say two ideas. So x and y, so this is the idea that we're going to change a variable, and rad is the idea that we're going to use this number to define multiple things, so we only do it once. Okay. I hope that will kind of explain the basics. This is just float x and y. We could do the same thing with integers, so instead of using a decimal point, we would just have a set number, would be the same thing. In fact, all these variables it's the same thing, but float and integers are very close to each other. We'll probably have a different tutorial to talk about different data types like Boolean or strings or things like that. All right, I hope that helps.